My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi. This is episode 5 of our Holophase journey. I want us to do something very simple and very radical at the same time. We are going to sit together with three of the oldest companions of human thought: time, space, and motion. We are not yet going to explain them in terms of Holophase. That comes later. Right now, our job is to look honestly at the long story of how humans have tried to understand these three ideas, from the earliest myths and philosophies all the way to modern physics. Only then will we be ready, in the next parts, to see what it really means to say that time, space, and motion are all expressions of one single underlying rhythm. So think of this episode as the dimensional prologue. We are walking through a museum of ideas about time, space, and motion. We will move slowly from room to room, from ancient times to the present day, and we will keep asking one quiet question. Have we really understood what these dimensions are, or have we just become very good at using them? I want to stress something from the beginning. This is still an introductory level discussion. I am not going to open a textbook and throw equations at you. Those will exist in the accompanying papers and technical documents where everything is written out rigorously for people who want to check every step. Here, together, we are doing something different. We are cleaning our conceptual lenses. We are trying to see clearly what we have believed about time, space, and motion, so that when Holophase offers a new answer, we can recognize how deep the shift really is. Let's start thousands of years ago, before science, before equations, before clocks. For most of human history, time was not a number on a device. Time was the sky. Day and night, sunrise and sunset, the slow drift of stars, the changing faces of the moon, seasons returning, bringing rain, harvest, cold, and warmth. Time was experienced as cycles, as patterns that repeat. People did not talk about seconds and microseconds. They talked about before the rains, after the harvest, during the long nights. Many ancient cultures pictured time as a great wheel. In India, there were vast cosmic cycles called yugas, in which entire worlds rise and fall. In Mesoamerica, calendars were wheels within wheels, turning through sacred cycles. In many African traditions, time was tied to events and ancestors, rather than to a uniform ticking. You could say that in these worldviews, time is not a straight line. It is a rhythm that comes and goes, like breathing. Space, for them, was not a coordinate grid. It was the land itself, the mountain to the north, the river that bends around the village, the dangerous forest to the west, the safe valley to the east. Space was made of places, not points. Stepping from one place to another was not moving along an axis. It was crossing boundaries between known and unknown, safe and dangerous, sacred and ordinary. Temples, graves, crossroads, city walls, all of these were points where space was thought to have special meaning. Motion, in that world, was the most obvious sign of life and change. Animals moving across the plain, clouds racing above, rivers flowing, people walking, running, dancing, fighting. Motion was not velocity, it was the visible pulse of the world. Stillness could mean death, movement meant life. In myth and early religion, these three, time, space, and motion, were woven into stories. Time might be a god, like Kronos, or a great wheel of ages. Space might be layered into heavens, earth, and underworld. Motion might be the work of spirits, winds, and invisible forces. These stories were not scientific, but they were attempts to make sense of the patterns of experience. Even then, one question kept returning. Is time something that flows by itself? Or is time simply the way we describe changes? Is space something that exists on its own? Or is space just the relationships between things? And what exactly is motion? Is it a thing inside the moving object, or just a way we talk about change? Those questions never went away. They just changed costumes. Now we step into the world of the ancient philosophers. In Greece, more than 2,000 years ago, thinkers like Heraclitus and Parmenides argued about change and permanence. Heraclitus looked at the world and saw constant motion. You cannot step into the same river twice, he said, meaning that everything is always flowing, always changing. For him, motion and change were the most basic facts of existence. Parmenides looked at the same world and said the opposite. He argued that true being must be unchanging, that change is an illusion of our senses. If reality is truly what is, then it cannot become what is not, and then become what is again. So motion and change cannot belong to the deepest layer of reality. Already here, you can see a tension that still lives inside physics today. Is the universe fundamentally dynamic, or is motion something that appears only when we look at it in a certain way? Then came Zeno, a student of Parmenides, who created his famous paradoxes to show that motion is impossible if you think of space and time as cut into infinitely many pieces. Achilles can never catch the turtle because he must first reach the place where the turtle was, and by then the turtle has moved a little further, and so on forever. A flying arrow taken at one instant is at rest, so how can a sum of resting states produce motion? To us, with our modern calculus, these paradoxes look solvable. We talk about infinite series that converge, and we feel clever, but in their time, they were a deep wound. They revealed that our intuitive picture of space as a line made of points and time as a flow made of instants is conceptually dangerous. Motion, time, and space do not fit together easily. Aristotle tried to repair this. He defined time as the number of motion with respect to before and after. In other words, for Aristotle, time is not something floating on its own. Time is a way of counting change. Without change, there is no time. Space for him was more like the place a body occupies, filled with substances, not an empty container. Already in Aristotle, you see something important. Time, space, and motion are not three separate, independent things. Time is defined through motion. Space is understood through the locations of bodies. None of them stand alone. Other traditions wrestled with similar ideas. In some Buddhist and Hindu philosophies, time was seen as dependent on change and perception. Without events and consciousness, time loses meaning. In Chinese philosophy, texts like the I Ching see the world as patterns of change, with time and space emerging from the unfolding of those patterns. Even without modern instruments, people kept circling around the same intuition. Perhaps these dimensions are not separate things, but ways that deeper order shows itself. Jump forward many centuries. Through the medieval period, through Islamic philosophers, Christian theologians, and many debates, the picture evolves slowly. Think of scholars like Augustine asking what God was doing before creation, and then realizing that the question itself may be wrong because time begins with the world. Or thinkers in the Islamic Golden Age debating whether space is an empty void or whether it is filled with subtle matter. In these discussions, time is often seen as created by God, perhaps beginning at a moment of creation. Space might be finite or infinite, containing the world like a shell. Motion is still deeply tied to causes and purposes. Stones fall because they seek their natural place. The heavens move in circles because circular motion is seen as perfect. But something is changing. Observation becomes more systematic. Mathematics becomes more powerful. People like Copernicus and Kepler begin to describe the motions of the planets with ever greater precision. The Earth is no longer the unmoving center. It becomes one moving body among many. The heavens, which were once perfect and unchanging, now reveal ellipses, irregularities, and subtle departures from circular motion. Slowly, the idea grows that nature might be governed by precise, universal laws that can be written down mathematically, and that time, space, and motion are the variables in those laws. Then, in the 17th century, the world changes dramatically. We enter the age of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. Galileo does something very simple and revolutionary. He rolls balls down inclined planes and watches how they move. He notices that motion has patterns that can be described with numbers. He also notices that if you are inside a smoothly moving ship, many experiments look the same as if you were standing still. You drop a ball from the mast and it lands at your feet, not behind you. This leads to the idea that motion is relative. There is no absolute rest. It depends on your point of view. Galileo also separates motion from purpose. Stones do not fall because they seek their natural place in some mystical sense. They fall because there is a regular, measurable acceleration. Motion becomes something you can predict, not something you explain with stories about inner tendencies. Descartes proposes that the essence of material things is extension, taking up space. He pictures space as something like a vast plenum of matter in motion with vortices and flows. Here, space and matter are deeply linked, yet Descartes still imagines something like a background geometry in which these motions occur. Then comes Newton. With his laws of motion and universal gravitation, he draws a clear picture. There is absolute space, a kind of infinite, unmoving stage. There is absolute time flowing at a constant rate, the same everywhere. Bodies move in this space as time passes according to precise laws. Motion is described by positions changing in time. Forces push and pull bodies, changing their motion. In this picture, time, space, and motion are three clearly separate concepts. Time is a universal clock ticking in the background. Space is a three-dimensional container in which all events happen. Motion is what you get when objects change their position in space as time moves forward. This framework works astonishingly well. From planets and comets to falling apples and pendulums, from tides to projectiles, Newton's universe seems complete. For 2 centuries, this picture dominates physics, engineering, and even philosophy. If you want to imagine the universe in the Newtonian way, imagine a perfectly polished, infinite chessboard, space, with a perfectly regular drumbeat playing in the background, time, and pieces gliding across the board according to precise rules, motion, and forces. Underneath, though, some questions remain. What is absolute space, really? If everything moved together in the same way, how would you know? What is absolute time apart from the changes it measures? And what exactly is motion if you can always switch to a moving point of view and call that rest? Leibniz, one of Newton's great contemporaries, pushed back. He argued for a relational view of space and time, that they are not things in themselves, but systems of relations between objects and events. In that view, talking about empty space without things in it is meaningless. This debate, absolute versus relational, never fully died. It just went quiet for a while. In the 19th century, the picture becomes richer and more complicated. On one side, thermodynamics emerges. Heat is no longer a mysterious fluid called caloric. It becomes associated with the microscopic motion of particles. Temperature is tied to average kinetic energy. Here, time takes on a new role. The direction in which entropy increases, the arrow of time appears. A simple image helps here. Imagine an egg falling off a table and smashing on the floor. You never see the reverse. Pieces of shell and a puddle of yolk suddenly leap up, form a perfect egg, and land gently on the table. The microscopic laws that govern the molecules are, in principle, reversible, but the overall behavior shows a strong direction, from ordered, low entropy states, the intact egg, to disordered, high entropy states, the splatter. Time, at this macroscopic level, seems to have a built-in arrow, so you have a tension. Fundamental laws treat time like a symmetric parameter, but macroscopic behavior treats time like a one-way street. On another side, electromagnetism arrives. Faraday thinks in terms of fields, invisible structures filling space, telling charges how to move. Maxwell writes his famous equations and discovers that these fields support waves that travel at a fixed speed, the speed of light. Space is no longer just a container, it is filled with fields. Motion becomes more subtle. Not only do particles move, but fields themselves carry energy and momentum. At this point, time is still absolute in the equations, but light has a strange property. Its speed seems to be the same in all directions, in all frames of reference. This will shake the foundations of Newton's picture. Enter Einstein and the birth of space-time. At the start of the 20th century, experiments like Michelson-Morley suggest that there is no motion through a preferred ether. The speed of light appears constant for all observers. Einstein proposes a new way to think about time and space. They are not separate absolute things, they are intertwined. A famous thought experiment helps. Imagine a long train and a person standing in the middle of it. 2 lightning bolts strike the front and back of the train. For a person standing on the platform, exactly halfway between the strikes, the flashes arrive at the same time. For the person on the train, who is moving toward one flash and away from the other, the flashes do not arrive together. In Newton's world, one of these observers must be wrong about what happened. In Einstein's world, both are right because simultaneity is relative. Different observers have different slices of space-time they call now. In special relativity, time and space become parts of a single 4-dimensional structure, space-time. The intervals between events are not measured by time alone or space alone, but by a combined space-time distance that remains the same for all observers. This leads to time dilation, moving clocks run slow, and length contraction. Moving rods become shorter along the direction of motion, not as tricks, but as real features of how space-time works. Now, motion is relative in a deeper way. There is no absolute state of rest. Different observers slice space-time differently into space and time. What is simultaneous for one observer might not be simultaneous for another. Time is no longer a universal flowing river. It is local and intertwined with space. General relativity goes even further. Gravity is no longer a force pulling masses together in a fixed background. Instead, matter and energy tell spacetime how to curve, and curved spacetime tells matter how to move. Planets orbit not because they feel a Newtonian force, but because they are following the straightest possible paths in a curved spacetime. Here, time and space are fully dynamical. The stage itself bends and stretches. Motion is geometry. This is a huge step. The old idea of space as a rigid container and time as a uniform flow are completely replaced. Instead, we have a flexible space-time whose geometry encodes both gravitational effects and the structure of causality, which events can influence which others. It is tempting to think, now we finally understand time and space. But then quantum theory arrives. Quantum mechanics brings a new shock. At very small scales, particles behave like waves. They do not follow single, sharp paths. Instead, they are described by wave-like objects that interfere, spread, and show strange correlations. A classic example is the double-slit experiment. You fire particles, one by one, at a barrier with two narrow openings, and you detect them on a screen behind the barrier. If you close one slit, you get a certain pattern. If you close the other slit, you get a similar pattern. But if you open both slits, you do not just get the sum of the two patterns, you get an interference pattern, as if each particle went through both slits and interfered with itself. The key quantity controlling this pattern is not energy alone, it is phase. The relative phase between paths determines where you see bright and dark regions. Where does time fit in this picture? In standard quantum theory, time enters the equations as a parameter. The wave function evolves in time. But time itself is not a quantum observable. There is no time operator in the same sense as position or momentum. Time is something we feed into the theory from outside. Space, on the other hand, can become part of the configuration space of the system. For one particle, we have a wave defined over ordinary three-dimensional space. For many particles, the wave lives in a much higher dimensional configuration space. So our picture becomes strange. The wave that describes the system does not live in the same three-dimensional space that we see around us. It lives in an abstract space of possibilities. Motion also becomes stranger. Instead of saying the particle moves from here to there along this path, we talk about probabilities of different outcomes, interference patterns, and expectation values. Between measurements, motion is described by a smooth evolution of the wave function. At measurement, something like a jump appears in the predictions. Quantum field theory combines special relativity and quantum mechanics by describing particles as excitations of fields that exist throughout spacetime. Space and time are still present as the arena in which fields live. Motion is encoded in how these field excitations propagate and interact. So at this stage, we have spacetime as a four-dimensional stage, possibly curved from relativity. Quantum fields living on that stage with excitations we call particles. Motion as the evolution and interaction of these excitations. Time is still treated in two very different ways, as a dynamic part of spacetime in general relativity and as an external parameter in most quantum formalisms. This tension is part of why building a theory of quantum gravity has been so hard. In the late 20th and early 21st century, new ideas began to circle around the possibility that spacetime itself might be emergent. Some approaches suggest that space could arise from more primitive structures, like networks of quantum entanglement. Imagine a huge graph of connections, where closeness in space corresponds to how strongly systems are entangled. Others imagine discrete building blocks of geometry, like tiny loops or spin networks, from which smooth space emerges in the large-scale limit. The slogan, "It from bit," appears in some circles. The idea that information, not matter or energy, might be the fundamental thing. In that view, space and time are ways information arranges itself. Black hole physics, holography, and ideas about the universe as a kind of quantum error-correcting code all add fuel to this line of thought. Others argue that time might be an illusion at the most fundamental level, a way of organizing change rather than a basic coordinate. In some timeless formulations, the universe is described as a whole, and what we call the flow of time arises from how different parts of this whole relate to each other. Books like The End of Time explore the idea that change is real, but time as an independent entity might not be. In all of this, motion is strangely neglected. We talk about emerging space, we debate whether time is fundamental, but we rarely ask, Is motion itself just a derived concept, or is it part of the fundamental structure? We use velocities, momenta, and trajectories every day in physics, but we rarely stop to ask what motion really is in ontological terms. Even when time and space are fused into spacetime, motion is treated as world lines drawn inside that spacetime. It is not given the same fundamental status. It becomes a kind of decoration on the stage, rather than a pillar as important as time and space themselves. So we reach the present day with a strange situation. We have incredibly successful mathematical formalisms. We can send rockets to other planets, build GPS systems that rely on relativity, design quantum devices that exploit superposition and entanglement. But when we stop and ask simple questions, what is time really? What is space really? What is motion really? The answers quickly slide into metaphors or into statements like, in our theory, time is the parameter t, or space is the manifold on which fields are defined. That is a description of how we model, not an explanation of what exists. Before we bring Holophase fully into the picture, I want you to notice something about your own experience. Right now, as you listen to this, you feel time as a flow. There is a sense of before this sentence and after this sentence. You feel space as the arrangement of things around you, the room, the objects, the distance to the door or the window. You feel motion when you move your hand, when your chest rises and falls as you breathe, when a car passes by outside or a fly crosses your field of view. To live is to swim in time, space, and motion. They are so intimate that we rarely question them. Even scientists, who question almost everything, often treat time, space, and motion as the given background on which their questions live. The history we just walked through shows that this confidence is fragile. At every major turning point in science, Aristotle, Newton, Einstein, quantum theory, the concepts of time, space, and motion have been reshaped. They are not fixed sacred objects. They are evolving ideas. And each time we changed them, we thought for a while that now we finally understood. Holophase invites us to take one more step. It says, maybe the reason we keep having to rewrite our story of time, space, and motion is that we have been starting at the wrong level. Maybe these dimensions are not the foundation. Maybe they are shadows, projections, or readouts of something simpler and deeper. This is where Holophase steps into the conversation. Holophase does not begin by adding a new field on top of spacetime. It does not say, here is spacetime, and in it we have some extra thing called phi. Instead, Holophase asks a deeper question. What if time, space, and motion are not the ground floor at all? What if they are different ways of reading a single underlying structure? The way temperature is a way of reading the average motion of particles, or the way money is a way of summarizing many different kinds of goods and services. In other words, what if time, space, and motion are not the bricks of reality, but shadows of something more primitive? In earlier episodes, we already challenged the idea that energy is the fundamental stuff. We said, energy is a powerful and beautiful summary, but it is not the ontic substrate. Now we are about to do something even more radical. We are going to say that the familiar stage on which we usually draw our pictures, the 3 dimensions of space, the 1 dimension of time, and the motions that dance inside them, are themselves readouts of a deeper pattern. The rest of this episode is about preparing the ground for that idea. In this first part, we walked through a brief, highly simplified history of how humans have thought about time, space, and motion. From mythic cycles and sacred places, through Greek puzzles and definitions, through Newton's absolute stage and clock, through thermodynamics and fields, through spacetime and quantum theory, into modern speculations about emergent spacetime. What we saw along the way is that our concepts have never been stable. Time has been seen as a god, a measure of motion, a coordinate, a dimension of spacetime, a parameter, possibly even an illusion. Space has been seen as a layered cosmos, a container, a web of relations, a manifold, perhaps an emergent structure. Motion has been seen as life, as change, as trajectories in a stage, as geodesics, as probabilistic evolution, sometimes as a problem rather than a primitive. In the technical side of the Holophase project, all of this history is translated into precise mathematical structures, into equations, operators, fields, and phase maps. Those details live in the papers and the full formalism, and they will be available for any listener who wants to follow every single step. Here, in this introductory path, our task is different. We are aligning our intuitions for the shift that is coming. And as always in this project, we will not be satisfied with beautiful words alone. When we say that time, space, and motion are readouts of phase, we will tie that claim to experiments, to concrete tests, to ways of being wrong. Just as we did when we dethroned energy as the primary substance, we will demand that this new dimensional picture can be checked, challenged, and, if nature disagrees, decisively falsified. The goal is not to win a philosophical debate. The goal is to let reality itself judge the model. In the next part of this episode, we will finally start to turn the camera around. Instead of asking what is time and what is space and what is motion separately, we will ask a different question. What single thing would have to exist in order for all three of these to show up the way they do? What kind of underlying structure could naturally produce the feeling of flow we associate with time, the geometry we associate with space, and the kinematics we associate with motion, all at once in a single move? Holophase answers that question with one word: phase. Not phase as a small technical detail in wave equations, not phase as the thing you ignore when you only care about intensities, but phase as the core ontic structure of reality, a continuous cyclic order woven through everything. In the following parts of episode 5, we will explore what it really means to say that time, space, and motion are three simultaneous readouts of a single phase field. We will see how this idea reshapes the puzzles we met in our historical tour: Zeno's paradoxes, the arrow of time, the relativity of simultaneity, the tension between quantum theory and general relativity. For now, I want you to simply hold this thought. For thousands of years, we have tried to understand time, space, and motion as if they were three separate mysteries. Holophase suggests that they are three faces of one underlying rhythm. In the next part, we will begin the work of making that claim precise together now.